A surgeon opens your chest, spreads your ribs, lifts your beating heart in a gloved hand, and you feel nothing. You are not asleep. You are not dreaming. You are simply gone. And here is the thing almost no one tells you. Nearly 2 centuries after the first ether demonstration in 1846, after billions of these small vanishings, we still cannot fully explain how it works. Consider what a molecule like propofol actually is. A ring of carbon, a scattering of hydrogen, an oxygen or two. A speck so small it would take 1 trillion of them to matter to a scale. It slips into your bloodstream, crosses into the brain in seconds, and finds its way to a protein called the GABA-A receptor, the same gatekeeper that quiets you into ordinary sleep. There, it settles into a hidden pocket, an allosteric site, and holds a chloride channel open a little longer than it should. Negative charge floods the neuron. The cell goes quiet. Multiply that by billions. But quieting neurons is not the mystery. Alcohol quiets neurons. The mystery is this: consciousness is not a light switch. It is a vast, recursive conversation, the brain talking to itself across regions, second by second. And somehow, these tiny molecules do not just dim it, they dissolve it, cleanly, reversibly. They walk a mind to the very edge of death, hold it there in perfect nothingness, and walk it back. So the question is not whether anesthesia works. The question is why it should be possible at all. So let your shoulders drop, and let the day loosen its grip on your jaw and your hands. This is Pharmasomnia, where we take the machinery of the body and slow it right down, night after night, until the science itself becomes something you can fall asleep to. If these slow journeys through your own chemistry bring you any rest at all, you might let the channel know with a like or a subscribe, and then we won't ask again, and we won't raise our voice for the rest of the long night. From here on, we only wander, and we only explain, softly, the machinery underneath your skin. Begin, tonight, in a small octagonal room in Boston, on a Friday morning in the middle of October in the year 1846. The room is a surgical theatre tucked beneath a dome, its seats rising in tight rings, and it will one day be called the Ether Dome, though on this morning no one in the crowd yet knows why. A young dentist named William Thomas Green Morton stands at the front with a glass inhaler in his hands, and inside that glass is a liquid that smells sweet and volatile and faintly of sin, diethyl ether. A patient named Gilbert Abbott sits waiting, a tumour beneath the angle of his jaw, and the surgeon, John Collins Warren, stands ready with his knife. And the astonishing thing, the thing that makes this the birthday of a whole science, is that when the blade goes in, the patient does not scream. Let that silence settle over you, the way a snowfall settles over a field at dusk, softening every hard edge until the world goes quiet. Because you have to understand what that silence replaced. In the era before this morning, surgery was a form of controlled violence measured in seconds, because seconds were all a human being could endure. Surgeons were prized not for their delicacy, but for their speed. A leg amputated in under a minute, the patient held down by strong men, biting on leather, drowning in their own fear. Pain, in that world, was not a side effect of surgery. Pain was surgery. And into that world, a sweet-smelling vapour arrived and simply switched it off, leaving the body present and breathing and utterly untouched by the agony being done to it. Warren turned to the stunned audience and said quietly, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." and medicine was never the same. Here is the sentence I want you to carry down into sleep with you, the spine of everything we will wander through tonight. And I will say it many times before the night is out, in many different ways. We have been switching off human consciousness, reliably, safely, hundreds of thousands of times a day for nearly 2 centuries, and we still cannot fully explain how it works. That is the paradox. Not that anesthesia is dangerous, but that it is so clean, so routine, so trusted, and so deeply mysterious at the level where it actually happens. We can do this. We simply cannot say, with certainty, why. Rest there a moment. It should unsettle you a little, and then, strangely, it should soothe you. The way it is soothing to know that the world is full of quiet competence built on top of things no one entirely understands. So let us name the founding agents, the 3 sweet vapors that opened the door, because names are anchors and we will return to them. Diethyl ether, Morton's agent, the one in the glass inhaler beneath the dome. Then chloroform, championed a year later across the Atlantic by the Scottish obstetrician James Young Simpson, who is said to have discovered its effect by inhaling it at his own dinner table and waking up on the floor. And nitrous oxide, laughing gas, which the chemist Humphrey Davy had inhaled and marvelled at decades earlier, and which the dentist Horace Wells tried to bring to the very same Boston stage before Morton, in a demonstration that failed publicly and humiliatingly, though the gas itself was sound. 3 molecules: diethyl ether, chloroform, nitrous oxide. Remember them, the way you might remember 3 lights along a shoreline as you drift out from it. And here already, in the first hour of the science, is the first clue that there is no single switch to flip. Because these 3 agents do not all do the same thing. And general anesthesia, we would slowly learn, is not one effect at all. It is at least 4 separate effects, braided together so tightly that for a century no one noticed they could be pulled apart. Let me lay them side by side for you, slowly, one at a time, the way you might lay 4 stones in a row on a windowsill. The first is unconsciousness, the loss of awareness itself, the lights going out behind the eyes, the sense that there is no one home to experience anything at all. The second is amnesia, the failure to form memories so that even if some flicker of experience occurred, no trace of it is written down, and the mind afterward finds only a seamless gap. The third is analgesia, the blunting of pain, the interruption of the signals that would otherwise scream up the spinal cord and into awareness. And the fourth is immobility, the stilling of the body, the suppression of the reflexes that would make a patient flinch and move away from the knife. Unconsciousness, amnesia, analgesia, immobility. 4 stones on the windowsill. Now here is the quiet astonishment, and it is worth slowing down for, because it is the whole reason this mystery exists. These 4 things are dissociable. You can have one without the others. They come apart. Nitrous oxide, that laughing gas, is a powerful analgesic and produces a drifting euphoria, but on its own it is a feeble hypnotic. It struggles to produce full unconsciousness at survivable concentrations. It blunts pain far better than it erases awareness. So there is analgesia sliding free of unconsciousness. And in the modern operating room, we now know that a drug can abolish memory while awareness itself lingers. A patient can be responsive, can follow a command, and yet lay down no memory of any of it, waking with a smooth and total blank where minutes of experience should be. There is amnesia sliding free of consciousness, and immobility, the stillness of the body under the knife, we would eventually trace not to the brain at all, but largely to the spinal cord, to circuits far below the seat of awareness. There is immobility sliding free of everything else. Let those 4 stones sit apart from one another on the sill, no longer a single object, but 4, each with its own quiet weight. Because this is the first and deepest reason that anesthesia should not be as simple as a switch. A switch has 1 wire and 2 positions. But if unconsciousness and amnesia and analgesia and immobility can each be produced separately, dialed up and down independently, then whatever a general anesthetic does, it is not throwing one switch. It is touching several systems at once, several different molecular targets, in several different regions of the nervous system. And the smooth, seamless going under that a patient experiences is an illusion of unity assembled from at least 4 separate silences. The oblivion feels like one thing. It is not one thing. It never was. And this is why, across the long night ahead, we are going to have to travel down through the tissue to find those separate targets. We are going to name real receptors and real ion channels, the GABA type A receptor, whose chloride gates so many of these agents seem to prise open. The NMDA receptor, the glutamate-driven channel that nitrous oxide and ketamine seem to jam shut. The 2-pore domain potassium channels with their strange names. The receptors for glycine down in the cord. We will get to all of them, patiently, one at a time. But hold, tonight, only this, that there are many of them, that no single one of them is the switch, and that this multiplicity is not a gap in our knowledge waiting to be filled by one tidy discovery. It may simply be the truth. Consciousness may have no single off switch because it has no single on switch, no one place where it lives to be extinguished. Breathe slowly and let that widen out beneath you like water. So the question that will be our spine through every chapter of this long night, is not whether anesthesia works. It plainly does. It has done so, reliably, since that Friday morning in the octagonal room in Boston. The question is not even, really, that it works. The question is how, and why it should be so clean. Why a handful of small, simple, chemically unremarkable molecules, some of them so simple you could almost draw them from memory, can slip into the most complex object in the known universe, the human brain, with its 86 billion neurons and their 100 trillion connections, and switch off the light of awareness so completely and so gently that the person inside experiences nothing, not even the passage of the time it takes, and then switch it back on again, whole. It should not be that clean. A thing that complex should not have a dial. And yet, consider, to feel the strangeness of it, just how ordinary these molecules are. Diethyl ether is 2 ethyl groups joined by a single oxygen, a tiny, greasy, volatile thing. Nitrous oxide is 1 nitrogen bonded to another, and then to a lone oxygen, a molecule of 3 atoms, lighter than the air you are breathing now. Chloroform is a single carbon carrying 3 chlorines and a hydrogen. These are not elaborate keys machined to fit elaborate locks. Some of them barely seem to fit any lock at all. For a long time, it was thought they worked simply by dissolving into the fatty membranes of nerve cells, a theory named for the men Meyer and Overton, who noticed that the more readily an agent dissolved in oil, the more powerfully it anesthetized. And there is truth buried in that old idea, a real correlation that held for decades. But it could not be the whole story, because a substance that worked by mere dissolving would have no reason to distinguish awareness from memory from pain. No reason for the 4 stones to come apart on the windowsill. Dissolving is blunt. What we see is subtle. And subtlety implies targets, specific proteins, specific channels, specific sites where these small molecules bind and gently change the shape of things. Let the mystery hold you the way deep water holds a swimmer, not gripping, just supporting, indifferent and vast. Because 2 centuries on, this is genuinely where we stand, and I want to be honest with you about it, though I will keep it light, the way you keep a candle light in a large, dark room. We know a great deal about where anesthetics bind. We can point to the GABA-A receptor and show you the crevice in its protein where a molecule of an intravenous agent nestles and holds the chloride gate a little more open, letting negative charge flood into the neuron and quiet it. We can point to the NMDA receptor and show you how nitrous oxide seems to plug it. We know the pharmacology of dozens of these targets in exquisite molecular detail. What we do not have, what no one yet has, is the bridge from all that molecular detail up to the vanishing of the self. We can tell you which locks the keys fit. We cannot yet tell you why, when enough of those particular locks are turned, the person simply stops being there, and then, later, returns. That is the 2-century silence. Not the silence of the patient under the knife. That silence we solved on a Friday morning in a room beneath a dome. The other silence. The silence in our own explanation. The gap between the molecule and the mind that we have been staring across, calmly and productively, and with astonishing practical success, for 170-odd years, never once falling in. So this is the shape of the journey ahead of you tonight. We began where the science began, in Boston, with William Morton and his glass inhaler, and a tumour removed from a sleeping man who felt nothing and remembered nothing and did not move. We named the 3 founding vapours, diethyl ether, chloroform, nitrous oxide, and we laid down the 4 stones that anesthesia is really made of: unconsciousness, amnesia, analgesia, immobility. And we watched them, quietly, come apart. And we set the one question that will follow us down through every layer of tissue between here and the morning. Not that it works, but how, and why it should be so impossibly, unnervingly clean. For now, that is enough. Let the octagonal room fade. Let the crowd in their tight rings dissolve. Let the sweet smell of ether thin out into the dark. Keep only the paradox, resting lightly on your chest as you breathe, that every night, all over the world, we switch off the human mind and switch it back on again, and we cannot yet say how, and it works anyway. Let that be the water you float on. We will go deeper, slowly, in the chapters ahead, but not yet. For now, just drift. Let us begin, then, with the oldest clue, the one that seemed, for the better part of a century, to solve everything. Imagine you are a chemist standing at the turn of the 20th century, holding a small collection of bottles. In each one, a different substance that can steal consciousness. Ether, chloroform, nitrous oxide, ethanol, long-chain alcohols, a scattering of gases and vapors that share almost nothing when you draw them on paper. Different sizes, different shapes, different atoms arranged in different geometries. Some are heavy and oily. Some are light enough to float away the moment you unstopper the jar. By every rule of chemistry, these molecules should behave in wildly different ways. And yet each of them, given in the right dose, does the same impossible thing. Each of them quiets the mind. That was the puzzle two men set out to solve, working separately, not knowing at first that they were solving the same one. Hans Horst Meyer in Germany, Charles Ernest Overton in Zurich. Two careful, patient investigators who, around the years 1899 to 1901, arrived at the same startling correlation from different directions. They asked a simple question, a question so simple it almost feels like cheating. What single property do all these anesthetics share that might predict how strong each one is? And they tested the most physically obvious property they could think of: how well each molecule dissolves in fat, in oil. They measured what is called the partition coefficient. If you shake a substance between a layer of water and a layer of oil, how does it distribute itself between the two? Some molecules love water and stay there. Some flee the water and pour themselves into the oil. Meyer used olive oil. Overton, in his exhaustive way, tested many oils and fatty solvents. And what they found still, more than a century later, has the power to stop you cold. The more a molecule preferred oil over water, the more potent an anesthetic it was. Not roughly, not approximately, almost perfectly. Plot the oil-water partition coefficient of an anesthetic on one axis and the concentration needed to abolish consciousness on the other, and the points fall along a straight line. A line that holds across agents differing in potency by a factor of 100,000. A gas as feeble as nitrous oxide, which is barely soluble in fat and needs enormous concentrations to work, sits at one end. A vapor like halothane, richly fat-loving and potent in tiny amounts, sits at the other. And in between, an unruly crowd of chemically unrelated molecules, molecules that have no business behaving alike, line up obediently along that single, beautiful diagonal. This is the Meyer-Overton correlation, and for decades it looked like the answer. Let the image settle for a moment, because it is a genuinely lovely one. Picture your neurons, the billions of them woven through your cortex and brainstem, and picture the membrane that wraps each of them. That membrane is not a solid wall. It is a double sheet of lipid molecules, a phospholipid bilayer, tails turned inward, heads turned out toward the watery world on either side. It behaves in some ways like a thin film of oil suspended in water, a skin of fat holding the wet electricity of the mind inside its shape. And here come these small molecules, ether and chloroform and their kin, each one fleeing the water of the blood, each one seeking the oil. Where do fat-loving molecules go? Into fat, into the membrane. And so, the theory almost wrote itself, and it was gorgeous in its simplicity. The lipid theory. The idea was this: anesthetics dissolve into the fatty membrane of the neuron, and once inside, they disrupt it. They swell it, or fluidize it, or perturb its ordered structure, the way a few drops of solvent thrown into a calm oil bath make it churn and loosen. And a membrane thrown into disorder, the theory said, can no longer do its work, can no longer let the right ions cross at the right moments, can no longer carry the electrical rhythm of thought. Consciousness, on this view, does not have a lock and a key. It simply drowns, molecule by molecule, in a rising tide of fat-dissolved anesthetic that softens the very walls of every nerve cell at once. It was non-specific. It was elegant. It required no particular target, no special receptor, no chosen protein. Only the universal fact that all these molecules like oil, and all our neurons are wrapped in something oil-like. For roughly 70 years, this was the reigning explanation. The correlation was so clean that questioning it felt almost perverse. But a correlation, however beautiful, is not a mechanism. And this is the quiet turn of our chapter, the place where the lovely straight line begins, gently, to betray itself. Because if you keep testing, if you keep pushing the theory toward its edges, 3 separate cracks appear, small at first, then wide enough to fall through. The first crack is called the cut-off effect, and it is the strangest. Take a family of molecules that differ in only one way, a homologous series of alcohols, each one a carbon longer than the last. Methanol, ethanol, propanol, butanol, and on up the chain. As you add carbons, each becomes more fat-loving than the one before. The partition coefficient climbs steadily, rung by rung. And for a while, exactly as Meyer and Overton would predict, anesthetic potency climbs right alongside it. More oil-loving, more potent. The line holds. But then, somewhere around 12 or 13 carbons, something happens that the lipid theory has no way to explain. The potency stops rising, and then it collapses. The very longest alcohols, the ones that dissolve into oil more eagerly than any of their shorter cousins, lose the power to anesthetize altogether. Fat solubility keeps climbing. The effect falls off a cliff. If dissolving in the membrane were the whole story, these long, greasy molecules should be the most potent of all. Instead, they do nothing. The tide keeps rising, and the mind refuses to drown. Sit with that, because it is the first sign that the membrane is not the target, or not the whole of it. There is a size beyond which the molecule simply will not fit, whatever it is supposed to fit. And a bare sheet of lipid has no size limit. A membrane will happily absorb a long molecule as readily as a short one. Only something with a defined shape, a defined volume, a pocket with walls, could care how long a molecule is. The cut-off effect is the shape of a container revealing itself by what it refuses to hold. The second crack is subtler still, and it turns on one of the most delicate facts in all of chemistry. Some molecules come in 2 forms that are mirror images of each other. The same atoms, the same bonds, the same everything, but arranged in left-handed and right-handed versions, like your 2 hands. We call these enantiomers, stereoisomers of opposite chirality. And here is the crucial point. 2 enantiomers dissolve in oil identically. Their partition coefficients are the same, because dissolving in a formless liquid does not care about handedness. Oil has no left or right. So, by the Meyer-Overton correlation, 2 enantiomers of the same anesthetic must be exactly equally potent. There is no room in the lipid theory for them to differ, and yet they do. The 2 enantiomers of isoflurane, a workhorse inhaled anesthetic still in use today, have measurably different potencies, one form more effective than its mirror twin at their target channels, despite dissolving in fat in precisely the same way. The membrane cannot tell them apart. Something else can. And what can tell a left hand from a right hand? Only another hand, only a shape, only a protein, a folded chain of amino acids with its own handedness, its own contours, a pocket that fits one mirror image and rejects the other, the way a right glove welcomes a right hand and fights a left. The stereoisomer problem is the second time the mind's off switch tells us quietly that it is not a puddle it is dissolving into. It is a lock. And locks, unlike puddles, are chiral. They have a shape that cares. The third crack is less a single experiment than a growing unease about the whole character of the thing. Consciousness does not fade the way a dissolving membrane theory predicts. If anesthesia were a slow, non-specific thickening of every neural membrane, we might expect a gentle, graded dimming, awareness sliding down a smooth ramp as the fatty walls grow steadily more disordered. But that is not what happens, and any anaesthetist will tell you so. There is a threshold. There is a startlingly sharp transition, a narrow window of concentration across which a patient goes from responsive to unresponsive, from present to absent. A switch, not a dimmer. And measurements of actual membranes bear out the deeper problem. The changes an anesthetic makes to the physical order of a lipid bilayer at clinical concentrations are vanishingly small, no larger than the change you would get by warming the membrane by a single degree. And nobody loses consciousness from being 1 degree too warm. The perturbation is real, but far too gentle to account for so total and so sharply bounded an effect. The tide rises by a hair, and yet the whole city goes dark at once. Membranes do not have thresholds like that. Proteins do. So we arrive, gently, at the reframing that will carry us through the rest of the night. The Meyer-Overton correlation was never wrong about what it measured. It was only wrong about what it meant. Lipid solubility is real, and it truly does predict potency with astonishing fidelity. But not because the membrane is the victim. It is because lipid solubility tells you where these molecules go. Fat-loving molecules leave the water and seek out oil-like environments. And the most oil-like environments in a cell are not only the open sheets of the membrane, they are the hidden interiors of proteins. Every protein folds itself so that its greasy, water-fearing parts turn inward, away from the surrounding fluid, forming small, hydrophobic pockets buried deep inside the molecule. Cavities, little oil-lined rooms tucked into the machinery of the cell. And an anesthetic that loves oil will find its way into exactly those rooms. The same physical preference that drove Meyer and Overton's straight line, now driving these molecules not into the wall, but into the machine. Do you feel the whole picture turn over? The correlation was a signpost, and we read it as a destination. It said, fat-loving molecules end up in fatty places. And we assumed the fatty place was the membrane, when all along it could as easily have been the oily heart of a protein, a binding pocket, a cavity in an ion channel, a hydrophobic cleft in a receptor. The partition coefficient measures the pull toward oil. It does not tell you whether the oil is a bare lipid sheet or the buried, folded interior of a specific protein target. And every crack we have found, the cutoff that reveals a fixed-size pocket, the enantiomers that reveal a chiral lock, the sharp threshold that reveals a switch and not a slope, every one of them points the same way, away from the formless membrane, toward the folded, shaped, selective protein. This is the bridge, and we will cross it slowly in the chapters ahead. Because once you accept that anesthetics act on proteins, on named, specific, real molecular machines, the whole question sharpens into something you can almost touch. Which proteins, which pockets, which channels and receptors have hydrophobic cavities exactly the right size to cradle a molecule of isoflurane, or propofol, or ketamine, and to feel the difference between its left and right hands. We already know the leading suspects, and their names will become as familiar as breath before the night is out. The GABA-A receptor, the great inhibitory gate of the brain, whose chloride channels so many anesthetics pry open. The NMDA receptor, the glutamate-gated channel that ketamine and nitrous oxide slip in to block. The two pore domain potassium channels, the TREC and TASC family, that certain agents hold ajar. These are proteins. They have shapes. They have pockets. They have handedness. And they, not the bare fat around them, are where the mind is quietly, precisely switched off. For now, though, let all of that rest at the edge of thought. Hold only the shape of the reversal. For 70 years, we believed consciousness dissolved into fat, a soft drowning of every membrane at once, elegant and non-specific, and, it turns out, not quite true. The straight line was real, the story we draped over it was wrong, and the corrected story leads us, gate by gate, to a single protein, the one that does more of the work of quieting than any other in the brain. So, let us go there now, slowly, the way you would descend a familiar staircase in the dark, one careful foot at a time, knowing the shape of each step before you reach it. The protein is called the GABA-A receptor. Say the name slowly and let it lose its strangeness. GABA is gamma-aminobutyric acid, the chief inhibitory neurotransmitter of the central nervous system, the molecule the brain releases not to speak, but to hush. And the GABA-A receptor is the ear that hears that hush and acts on it. Nearly a third of all the synapses in your brain are inhibitory. Nearly a third of the ceaseless conversation is not signal, but restraint. Not the pressing of keys, but the lifting of fingers, and most of that restraint passes through this one receptor, this one gate, again and again, millions of times each second, while you sit here breathing. Picture the receptor itself. It is not a solid thing, but an assembly. 5 protein subunits gathered in a ring, a pentamer, standing upright in the fatty membrane of the neuron like 5 staves of a barrel drawn together around a hollow center. Down the middle of that ring runs a pore, a channel, sealed shut in its resting state. The 5 subunits are drawn from a family with letters for names, alpha, beta, gamma, and others, and the commonest arrangement in the adult brain is 2 alpha, 2 beta, and a single gamma, set around the ring in a fixed order, each subunit contributing its wall to the pore and its face to the seams between them. Remember those seams. The seams between the subunits, alpha beside beta, beta beside alpha, are not empty joins. They are pockets. They are where the anesthetics will go. When GABA arrives, released from a neighboring neuron, drifting across the narrow synaptic cleft, it does not enter the pore. It settles instead into 2 binding sites at the interfaces between the alpha and beta subunits, on the outer face of the receptor, where the extracellular domains meet. 2 molecules of GABA, one in each site, and the receptor answers with a change of shape. The 5 staves twist, ever so slightly, a concerted rotation transmitted down through the protein, and the pore that was sealed springs open. And what flows through it is not sodium, not calcium, nothing that would excite. What flows through it is chloride, negatively charged chloride ions, drawn inward down their electrochemical gradient, sliding through the opened channel into the body of the neuron. Hold that image, because everything downstream depends on it. Chloride is negative. When it flows inward, the inside of the neuron, already negative at rest, grows more negative still. The membrane voltage sinks further from the threshold at which the cell would fire. We call this hyperpolarization, a deepening of the electrical hush, a pushing away from action. A neuron poised to speak finds itself, with each pulse of chloride, drawn back below the brink. It is not silenced by force. It is simply made reluctant. The threshold to fire lifts higher, and the small excitations that would have tipped it over now fall short. Multiply that reluctance across a third of the synapses in the brain, and you begin to feel the shape of what is coming. Not a wall, but a great and gathering slowness, spreading gate by gate through the whole dark forest of the cortex. Now bring in the drug, the one that pours white into the vein, the one the anaesthetists have nicknamed milk of amnesia for the pale emulsion it arrives in. Propofol. Its true name is 2,6-disopropylphenol, an oily molecule so unfriendly to water that it must be carried in a suspension of soybean oil and egg lecithin, which lends it that opaque, milky colour as it slides down the line. But follow it inward, past the whiteness, to the place it is going. Propofol does not sit where GABA sits. It does not touch the two alpha-beta sites on the outer face. It goes deeper, down into the membrane-spanning body of the receptor, into a pocket buried in the transmembrane region, at a seam between a beta subunit and an alpha subunit, cradled in the oily heart of the protein where the fat and the channel meet. And there it does something subtle and enormous. It does not open the channel by itself, not at first, not at the doses that carry you gently under. Instead, it changes how the receptor answers GABA. This is what we call positive allosteric modulation. Allosteric, from the Greek, for another shape, a molecule that binds at one site and reshapes the behavior of another. With propofol nestled in its transmembrane pocket, the receptor becomes more willing. When GABA arrives at its sites, the channel opens more readily, stays open longer, admits more chloride per pulse of transmitter. The brain's own hush is amplified. Every whisper of GABA answered now with a fuller, longer flood of negative charge. The inhibition that was already there is deepened, potentiated, drawn out. And as the dose climbs higher, propofol stops merely helping and begins to act alone. At greater concentrations, it can gate the channel directly, prying the pore open with no GABA present at all, so that the hush no longer waits for permission. First, it makes the brake more sensitive. Then, pressing harder, it becomes the brake itself. Feel the difference between those two actions, because it matters. At the doses that carry you into sleep, propofol is a modulator, a hand laid gently over the brain's own hand, guiding it to press a little firmer. At the doses of deep anesthesia, it is the foot on the pedal outright. One molecule, two mechanisms, sliding from persuasion into command as the concentration rises. This is why anesthesia is not a switch, but a dial. Why the anaesthetist watches and titrates rather than simply flipping you off. Because the drug's very manner of acting changes with its abundance, and the border between modulation and direct gating is a border the body crosses gradually, breath by breath. Now let another agent enter, a cousin in effect, but not in kind. Etomidate. Where propofol nestles at the beta-alpha seam, etomidate finds its pocket at the interface centered on the beta subunit. The same broad neighborhood of the transmembrane domain, the same principle of allosteric potentiation, yet its own precise address in the protein. Etomidate, too, makes the GABA-A receptor more willing, too lengthens and deepens the chloride current, too carries consciousness down into the dark. It is prized in the operating room for its gentleness to the failing heart, for the way it can render a patient unconscious without letting blood pressure fall away. But it carries a shadow, and the shadow is instructive, because it teaches us that a drug's shape does not politely confine itself to the target we intend. Etomidate, you see, does not only bind the GABA-A receptor. Its molecular shape happens to fit, unhappily, into an enzyme far from the brain, an enzyme called 11-beta-hydroxylase, tucked in the cortex of the adrenal glands, where the body manufactures its stress hormones, its cortisol, its aldosterone. Etomidate inhibits that enzyme. It slips into the machinery of hormone synthesis and jams a single step, and so a drug given to quiet the mind also, silently, suppresses the adrenal gland's ability to make cortisol, for hours after a single dose, for dangerously long after a continuous infusion. This is why etomidate, for all its cardiac kindness, is not given as a drip to hold patients under for days. One molecule, two locks. The receptor we aimed for, and the enzyme we did not. Remember it, because it is the whole lesson of pharmacology in miniature, that a shape is not loyal, that the pocket it fits in the brain may have a twin in the gland, and that every drug we love for one action, we must watch for another. Now reach further back in time, to an older family, the first true intravenous doorway into oblivion. The barbiturates, thiopental, sodium thiopental, the drug that for generations was the induction agent, the one that carried the counting backward patient under before the newer agents came. It too works at the GABA-A receptor. It too has its transmembrane pocket, its own seam among the subunits. But here the mechanism turns on a different hinge, and the difference is worth holding slowly in the mind, because it reveals that even drugs that share a target do not share a manner. Consider what a channel does in time. When GABA opens it, the pore does not stay open forever. It flickers, opening and closing, admitting chloride in bursts. There are two ways a drug might deepen the inhibition that follows. It might make the channel open more often, increasing the frequency of those bursts so that more of them occur for each arrival of GABA. Or it might make each opening last longer, increasing the duration so that each time the pore springs wide, it lingers, admitting a longer draft of chloride before it shuts. These are two distinct dials on the same machine, frequency and duration, and different drug families turn different ones. The benzodiazepines, the diazepams and midazolam, which bind at yet another seam, the interface between alpha and gamma, turn the frequency dial. They cannot open the channel without GABA. They only make the openings more frequent when GABA is present, which is part of why, taken alone, they are so much safer, so much harder to die from. The barbiturates turn the duration dial. Thiopental prolongs the open time of the channel, holding the pore wide for longer with each opening, and at higher concentrations like propofol, it too can throw the channel open with no GABA at all. Frequency for the benzodiazepines, duration for the barbiturates. 2 families, 1 receptor, 2 different hands on 2 different dials, and this is why the barbiturates, able to force the channel open unaided, can press the brain down into silence so complete that breathing itself stops, while the benzodiazepines, tethered to the brain's own GABA, so rarely can. Let all these agents blur now, for a moment, into their single common consequence, and let the consequence become a landscape. Somewhere in the cortex, a neuron that was about to fire falls quiet. Then another. Then a field of them. Every inhibitory synapse in the deepening brain is being potentiated at once. Every GABA-A receptor answering its transmitter with a fuller flood of chloride. Every pyramidal cell pulled a few millivolts further from its threshold. Every fast oscillation of thought slowing, broadening, folding toward the long, slow waves of unconsciousness. Every seam between alpha and beta filling with the drug. Every pore lingering open. Every burst of chloride a little longer, a little fuller than it would have been. Every reluctant neuron made more reluctant still. It is not a single silence, but a summation of silences, a countless multitude of tiny hushings gathering into one great stillness, the way a snowfall is not one weight, but the patient accumulation of numberless small ones until the whole forest lies muffled and white. And through all of it, propofol is already leaving. This is the strange grace of the drug, the reason it became the anaesthetist's favorite for the brief procedure, the colonoscopy, the closed reduction, the daily 1,000-fold induction. Follow its journey through the body now, because the pharmacokinetics are as elegant as the mechanism. Injected into the vein, propofol reaches the brain within a single circulation, a matter of seconds. The arm, the heart, the carotid, the cortex, because it is so richly fat-loving that it crosses the blood-brain barrier almost unhindered. Consciousness dissolves in under a minute, and then, almost as quickly, it begins to fade. Not because the drug is destroyed, but because it is redistributed. The brain is richly perfused, but small. The body's other tissues, the muscle and the fat, are vast and slower to fill. The propofol that flooded the brain now flows back out down its gradient, out of the neurons and into the great reservoirs of muscle and adipose, and as it leaves the brain, the concentration there falls, and consciousness returns, often within minutes of a single dose, long before a single molecule has been broken down. Redistribution, not metabolism, ends the brief sleep. But the molecules are not gone, only moved, and the body must still be rid of them. Here, the liver takes up the work. The hepatocytes conjugating propofol, dressing it in glucuronide and sulfate groups by the enzymes of phase 2 metabolism, rendering the oily molecule water-soluble at last, so the kidneys may carry it out in the pale tide of urine, and the body may be clean again. Propofol, then, is a study in speed, a molecule that finds its seat, does its quiet work, and is swept away almost before you have finished counting backward. But it is only one door into the darkened room, and there are others, built to older designs, opening onto different kinds of night. Consider now a different molecule and a different way of being made quiet. Its name is midazolam, and where propofol is oil, midazolam is a chameleon, a molecule that changes its very shape according to the water around it. In the vial, In the acidic solution the manufacturers prepare, midazolam wears an open ring, a small structural door swung wide, and in this configuration it is water-soluble, content to dissolve, easy to inject without the sting and the emulsion that propofol requires. But the blood is not acidic. The blood holds itself near a pH of 7.4, faithful and steady, and the moment midazolam enters that gentle alkalinity, the ring swings closed. The molecule folds itself into a lipid-soluble form, and now, transformed, it slips through the blood-brain barrier as easily as breath through an open window. One molecule, two faces, soluble in the syringe, soluble in the membrane, the transition governed entirely by the pH of its surroundings. Chemists call this a pH-dependent ring opening, and it is the quiet elegance that lets a single compound be both easy to give and quick to arrive. And where does it arrive? At a receptor we have met before, the GABA-A receptor, that same chloride channel, that same 5-part gate assembled from its subunits, standing sentinel across the membranes of the brain's inhibitory circuits. But midazolam does not sit where propofol sits. It does not settle into the interface between the beta and alpha subunits where the anesthetic finds its hold. Midazolam seeks a different seat entirely, a specific pocket at the interface between an alpha subunit and the gamma-2 subunit, a site so particular, so precisely shaped for this family of molecules that we have named it for them, the benzodiazepine binding site. It is a keyhole cut for a single kind of key, and midazolam turns in it perfectly. Now, here is the distinction that matters, the difference that makes midazolam gentler than the older sleeps. Midazolam does not open the chloride channel itself. It cannot. Left alone at that site, it does nothing at all to the flow of ions. It is silent, inert, waiting. What it does instead is listen for GABA, the brain's own inhibitory messenger, the molecule the neurons themselves release to quiet their neighbors. When GABA arrives and binds its own site on the receptor, the channel opens. And when midazolam is seated in its pocket, that opening happens more readily, more often. The receptor becomes more willing, more responsive, more easily persuaded to let the chloride in. Midazolam raises the frequency with which the channel flickers open in the presence of GABA. It does not force the door, it lowers the threshold at which the door will swing. This is what pharmacology calls positive allosteric modulation, a molecule that changes the shape and behavior of a receptor from a distance, tuning it, sensitizing it, without ever occupying the seat of the natural messenger. Midazolam is not the voice that says, "Be still." It is the hand that turns up the volume on the brain's own whisper of stillness. Hold that word, frequency, and set beside it another word, and you will see the whole family of these sedatives divide neatly in two. The barbiturates, the older drugs, the thiopentals of an earlier era, also work at the GABA-A receptor, also amplify inhibition, but they do it differently. They prolong the duration of each channel opening, holding the door open longer once it has swung, and at high enough concentrations, they abandon even the pretense of needing GABA at all, prying the channel open directly, by themselves, whether the brain's own messenger is present or not. That is the fatal difference. A drug that increases only the frequency of opening, midazolam, still depends utterly on GABA being there, and there is only so much GABA, only so many channels, only so much inhibition the tissue can express. And so, Midazolam has a ceiling, a natural limit past which more drug produces little more effect, because the brain's own supply of GABA is finite, and the modulation can only amplify what is already present. This ceiling is the reason for its safety margin, the reason a benzodiazepine alone rarely stops the breath the way a barbiturate can. Because the barbiturate has no such ceiling, no dependence on the brain's own signal, and can drive the inhibition down and down until the brainstem forgets to breathe. Frequency has a limit. Duration and direct gating do not. So picture the two of them side by side at the same receptor, the same chloride gate, the same 5 subunits standing in their ring. Midazolam sits at the alpha-gamma-2 interface and quickens the flicker of the channel, but only when GABA is there to command it. A modulator, a tuner, a raiser of frequency with a ceiling built into its very mechanism. The barbiturate sits elsewhere on the same receptor and holds each opening longer, and past a threshold throws the gate wide on its own. A molecule without a ceiling, without a limit, without the brain's own permission. 2 drugs, 1 receptor, 2 mechanisms, and the difference between them is measured in the quiet arithmetic of who lives when the dose climbs too high. And because midazolam works by turning a key in so specific a lock, there is a way to turn that key back. There exists a molecule called flumazanil, and it seeks the very same seat, the benzodiazepine binding site at the alpha-gamma-2 interface, but when it arrives, it does nothing. It neither raises the frequency nor lowers it. It simply sits, occupying the pocket, a competitive antagonist that fills the keyhole so that midazolam cannot. Give flumazanil to one who sleeps under midazolam's spell, and the modulation lifts. The drug is displaced from its seat. The receptor returns to its ordinary responsiveness, and the sleeper stirs and wakes, sometimes within a minute or two, the darkened room brightening as the tuner is lifted away from the strings. It is one of the few sedations we can so cleanly reverse, precisely because it works at so precise a site, a single door and a single key that fits it, and a single hand to close it again. And when midazolam's work is done, when it is time for the molecule to leave, it does not depend on redistribution alone, as propofol does. It goes instead to the liver, to a particular enzyme in the great metabolic machinery of the hepatocytes, cytochrome P450 3A4, the workhorse we call CYP3A4, the same enzyme that handles so vast a share of the medicines we swallow and inject. There, midazolam is hydroxylated, oxidized at a precise carbon, transformed into a compound called alpha-hydroxymidazolam, which is itself briefly active before it too is conjugated with glucuronide and swept out through the kidneys. And because CYP3A4 handles so many other molecules, midazolam lives inside a web of interactions, slowed by the drugs that inhibit that enzyme, the antifungals and certain antibiotics that clog its active site and let midazolam linger far longer than intended, hastened by the drugs that induce it, that tell the hepatocyte to build more of the enzyme, so that midazolam is cleared before it can do its quiet work. The sleep midazolam gives is thus not a fixed thing, but a negotiated one, its depth and duration written partly by whatever else already moves through the liver's patient chemistry. So we have 2 doors now into the same darkened room, and both of them open onto the GABA-A receptor. Propofol at its interface, midazolam at another, both of them working through chloride, through inhibition, through the brain's own language of quiet. But there is a third door, built on an entirely different frame, opening not onto GABA at all, but onto a different messenger, a different circuit, a different kind of night. And to find it, we must leave the chloride channel behind and travel to a small, dense knot of cells deep in the brainstem, a place where wakefulness itself is manufactured. Its name is the locus ceruleus, the blue place, so called for the pigment its neurons carry, and it is one of the great engines of arousal in the mammalian brain. From this small nucleus, threads of neurons reach outward and upward across nearly the whole of the cortex, and along those threads travels a single molecule whose presence means be awake, be alert, be watchful. Norepinephrine, the noradrenaline of vigilance, the chemical tone of a mind on guard. Consider now the molecule we bring to this place, and its name is dexmedetomidine, and it does not touch GABA, and it does not touch chloride, and it does not sit anywhere near the benzodiazepine seat. Dexmedetomidine is an agonist, a molecule that binds a receptor and activates it, that speaks the receptor's own language rather than merely tuning it. And the receptor it seeks is the alpha-2 adrenergic receptor, and it seeks it with remarkable devotion, a selectivity for alpha-2 over its alpha-1 cousin so high that at ordinary doses it speaks almost purely to this one kind of listener. And where are these alpha-2 receptors most consequentially arranged? Upon the very neurons of the locus ceruleus, and here is the beautiful inversion at the heart of this drug. These are autoreceptors, receptors the noradrenergic neuron places upon itself, a thermostat wired into its own membrane, so that when norepinephrine rises, the neuron senses its own output and falls quiet, dialing itself down. Dexmedetomidine arrives and binds these autoreceptors and tells the neuron, in the neuron's own chemical voice, that it has spoken enough, and the locus ceruleus, deceived by a molecule wearing the shape of its own restraint, falls silent. And when it binds, what happens inside the cell is the quiet machinery of an inhibitory G protein, the alpha-2 receptor coupled to what we call GI, the inhibitory guanine nucleotide binding protein, which upon activation does two things at once. It closes down adenylyl cyclase, lowering the cell's cyclic AMP, dimming the second messenger that keeps the neuron energized and firing. And it opens potassium channels while dampening calcium channels, so that potassium flows outward and the membrane drifts toward hyperpolarization, further and further from the threshold at which it would fire. The neuron of the locus ceruleus, muffled from within, ceases to send its signal of "be awake" up the long threads to the cortex. And as that noradrenergic tone falls away across the brain, the arousal it sustained falls with it, not by flooding the cortex with inhibition, not by prying open chloride gates, but simply by withdrawing the signal that said, "Stay awake." The way a room dims, not because you have drawn a curtain, but because someone far away has quietly turned down the lamp. And here is the strangest and most tender fact of this third door. The sleep that dexmedetomidine gives is not like the others. When propofol or midazolam quiet the brain, the electrical patterns they produce upon the scalp look little like true sleep. They are their own strange country, a suppression unlike anything the resting brain naturally does. But when the locus ceruleus falls silent under dexmedetomidine, it silences, by the very same pathway the brain itself uses when it descends into natural, dreamless, non-REM sleep. For the fading of noradrenergic tone from the locus ceruleus is one of the true physiological gateways into slow-wave sleep, the deep stage 3 quiet of an ordinary night. And so the sedation dexmedetomidine gives mimics that natural descent more closely than any other agent we possess. A sleep from which the sleeper can often be roused to answer, then sinks again when left alone. A sleep that spares breathing in a way the GABA drugs do not, because it never touches the brainstem's respiratory rhythm at all. It borrows the brain's own road into the dark, rather than building a new one. And so we arrive, by 3 separate paths, at the same threshold. Not all off is the same off. Propofol floods the chloride gates and empties the cortex into a suppression that is its own strange silence. Midazolam turns a key at a precise seat and raises the frequency of the brain's own whisper of stillness, gently and quietly. And dexmedetomidine leans on the locus coeruleus and lets the descending arc of natural sleep carry the mind down. 3 doors, 3 different kinds of darkness, but every one of them, in its own way, has been a story of quieting, of turning something down, of hushing the excitable brain into stillness. Tonight, we open a door that does the opposite, or rather, it does something so strange that the old vocabulary of down and quiet begins to fail us entirely. Because until now, every drug we have followed has worked by pressing on the brake. Propofol, the benzodiazepines, dexmedetomidine, each one, in its own dialect, spoke to the machinery of inhibition, the GABA-A receptor and its chloride gate, the alpha-2 adrenoceptor and its brake on noradrenaline. Each one leaned harder on the pedal that slows the traffic of the mind. But there is another way to still a moving thing. You do not always have to press the brake. Sometimes you can simply lift your foot from the accelerator, or cut the cable that connects the pedal to the engine at all. That is the country we enter now. And to understand it, we have to meet the accelerator itself. In the vast electrical parliament of the brain, there are 2 great parties forever in tension. There is inhibition, whose chief messenger is GABA, and whose gates we have already opened all evening. The party of hush, of stillness, of the closing door. And opposite it sits excitation, whose chief messenger is a small plain molecule called glutamate, the most abundant excitatory neurotransmitter in your entire nervous system. Glutamate is the yes of the brain. It is the messenger that says fire, that says continue, that says this signal matters, pass it on. Nearly every thought you have ever had rode, at some point, on a pulse of glutamate crossing a synapse. And glutamate speaks to several kinds of listeners, several families of receptors that answer its call. But one of them is unlike all the others, strange and conditional and beautiful in its logic. It is called the NMDA receptor, named, as these things often are, for a synthetic molecule, N-methyl-D-aspartate, that happens to switch it on in the laboratory. And the NMDA receptor is not a simple gate. It is a coincidence detector, a molecular device that opens only when 2 separate conditions are met at once. Picture a channel threaded through the membrane of a neuron, a pore that, when open, lets charged particles cross. Sodium and potassium, yes, but crucially, calcium, that most eloquent of intracellular messengers. For that pore to open, glutamate must arrive and bind. But glutamate alone is not enough. The NMDA receptor asks for a second key as well, a co-agonist, a molecule of glycine or of D-serine that must be present at a separate site on the very same receptor. 2 ligands, 2 sites, and only when both are occupied does the receptor even consider opening. It is a lock with 2 keyholes. But even that is not the whole of it. Even with glutamate bound and glycine bound, the channel may still be plugged. For sitting inside the open mouth of the pore, held there by the ordinary negative voltage of a resting neuron, is a single ion of magnesium. At rest, the inside of a neuron is electrically negative, and that negativity draws the positively charged magnesium down into the throat of the channel and wedges it there like a cork. Glutamate may call, glycine may answer, but the magnesium cork remains and calcium cannot pass. The channel is open and blocked at the same time. And here is the exquisite part. The magnesium cork is voltage dependent. It is held in place only so long as the neuron stays negative inside. But if that same neuron is already being excited by its other inputs, if enough ordinary signals have arrived to drag its interior voltage upward toward the positive, then the electrical grip on the magnesium loosens and the cork is expelled. Only then, with glutamate bound, glycine bound, and the membrane already depolarized, does the NMDA channel truly open and let calcium flood inward. So the NMDA receptor fires only when 2 things coincide: a chemical signal, glutamate, and an electrical context, a cell already active. It listens for the moment when a message arrives at a neuron that is already listening. This is the molecular basis of association, of one thing being linked to another, of coincidence becoming memory. The calcium that pours through an open NMDA channel is not merely charge. It is a signal that reshapes the synapse itself, strengthening the connection, laying down the physical trace of learning. This receptor is, in a very literal sense, where the brain writes things down. Now imagine a drug that walks into that open throat and takes the magnesium's place. Not a molecule that presses on the inhibitory brake, but one that reaches into the accelerator itself and jams the channel that says yes. That drug exists, and its name is ketamine. Ketamine does not compete with glutamate for its binding site. It does not stand at the door and refuse to let glutamate in. Instead, it slips past all of that, down into the open pore, and lodges at a site deep within the channel, the same site once identified with the drug phencyclidine, the PCP site, buried in the conducting path itself. This makes ketamine a non-competitive, open-channel blocker. It can only enter and bind when the channel is already open, already activated by glutamate and glycine and a depolarized membrane. It blocks, in other words, precisely the channels that are working hardest. This is what pharmacologists call use dependence, and it is a thing of quiet elegance. The more active a given NMDA channel, the more often it opens, the more opportunity ketamine has to enter and plug it. The busiest synapses, the ones firing most insistently, are the ones most thoroughly silenced. Ketamine finds the loudest conversations in the brain and steps into the middle of each one, and the calcium that would have flowed, the association that would have been written, simply does not occur. The coincidence detector is uncoupled. The yes is intercepted mid-word. And the consequence of this is a state utterly unlike the GABA-ergic descent we followed all evening. When propofol floods the chloride gates, the cortex empties towards silence, toward the burst suppression of a nearly flat and featureless dark. But ketamine does not empty the cortex. It does something far stranger. It severs the lines of communication between regions while leaving the regions themselves awake and firing. The cortex does not go quiet. In many places, it grows more active, not less, its rhythms fracturing into fast and dreamlike patterns. What ketamine takes away is not activity, but integration, not the fire, but the coherence of the fire. This is why the state ketamine produces has its own name. It is not called sedation, it is called dissociation. And to be dissociated is not to be dimmed, it is to be disconnected, the cortex still speaking, still generating images and thoughts, and even vivid dreams, but speaking now only to itself, cut off from the streaming report of the senses, cut off from the body, cut off from the anchoring sense of where and when and who one is. The lights are on, the rooms are full, but the hallways between them have been closed, and the world outside the building can no longer get in. Consider what this means at the bedside and why it makes ketamine so precious a drug. Because it works by intercepting glutamate rather than pressing the GABA brake, ketamine does not produce the deep collapse of arousal that the sedative hypnotics do. It leaves much of the brainstem's machinery intact. The airway reflexes are largely preserved. The drive to breathe, that ancient rhythm we spoke of earlier, generated deep in the medulla, is not extinguished the way a large dose of propofol can extinguish it. And rather than dropping the blood pressure, ketamine tends to lift it, because in blocking NMDA transmission, it indirectly releases a surge of the body's own sympathetic tone, a rise in noradrenaline that quickens the heart and holds the pressure up. Here is an anesthetic that provides profound analgesia and dense amnesia, while the patient's cardiovascular and respiratory systems remain, in relative terms, stable and self-sustaining. In the wreckage of trauma, in the field, in the operating rooms of the poorest places on earth, this combination has saved more lives than can be counted. There is a cost, of course, woven into the same mechanism that gives the gift. The very disconnection that spares the brainstem is the disconnection the mind experiences as strangeness, the emergence phenomena, the vivid and sometimes frightening dreams, the sense of leaving the body, of dissolving, of watching oneself from somewhere near the ceiling. The cortex, richly active and severed from its usual moorings, generates experience unconstrained by the correcting hand of the senses. It is dreaming with the eyes open. And when the drug recedes, and the hallways reopen, and the sensory world floods back in, the patient may carry back fragments of that untethered country. Images from a place the brake-pressing drugs never visit. Follow ketamine, then, through the body after it is given. It is lipophilic, richly fat-loving, and it crosses from blood into brain with remarkable speed, which is why a single intravenous dose can pull a mind into dissociation within a minute or less. But that same lipophilicity means the drug does not linger in the brain. It redistributes swiftly out into the fat and muscle of the body, and consciousness returns not because the drug is gone, but because it has moved, drained away from the site of action into the wider tissues. The same redistribution story we told of propofol. The offset of a single dose is a story of movement, not of destruction. The destruction comes later, and it happens in the liver. Ketamine is carried to the hepatocytes, and there met by the cytochrome P450 enzymes, principally CP3A4, with CYP2B6 and others lending a hand. The same great chemical furnaces that transform so many of the drugs we have followed. These enzymes strip a methyl group from ketamine in a reaction called N-demethylation, and in doing so, they produce a metabolite that is not inert at all. Its name is norketamine, and it is itself an active NMDA antagonist, perhaps a third as potent as its parent, circulating onward and extending the drug's analgesic reach even as the original molecule fades. Norketamine is in turn hydroxylated and conjugated, and finally surrendered to the kidneys and the urine, the last quiet exit. And it is worth a moment's wonder that some of these downstream metabolites, the hydroxynorketamines, may carry actions of their own quite apart from the NMDA channel, a possible thread in the strange and separate story of why ketamine, at low doses, can lift the weight of severe depression for days after a single infusion. But that is a tale for another night. Ketamine is not alone in this country of the torn curtain. There are other drugs that still the mind, not by pressing the GABA brake, but by cutting the glutamate cable. And two of them are gases, breathed rather than injected, and each is stranger and cleaner than the last. The first is the oldest anesthetic still in use, older than almost anything in our pharmacology. Nitrous oxide, the laughing gas, first breathed for its giddy pleasures more than 2 centuries ago. For the longest time, no one knew how it worked, and even now its mechanism is a braided thing, several actions at once. But at its heart, nitrous oxide too is an NMDA antagonist. It slips into the same excitatory machinery and damps the calcium-carrying yes of the glutamate synapse, and much of its analgesia and its dreamy dissociative lightness flows from exactly this. But it does not stop there. Nitrous oxide also reaches, remarkably, into the body's own opioid system, triggering the release of endogenous opioid peptides in the midbrain that act at the mu-opioid receptor to blunt pain along the descending pathways, the brain's own morphine, called forth by an inhaled gas. And it touches, too, a family of background potassium channels, the 2-pore domain or K2P channels, the same quiet leak channels that help set the resting voltage of neurons. By holding these open, it nudges cells towards stillness. An NMDA antagonist, an indirect opioid, a potassium channel modulator, nitrous oxide is a chord, not a single note, and that braided action is why it soothes and lightens and lifts the edge of pain without, on its own, ever quite carrying a patient all the way into surgical oblivion. And then there are the channels that were open all along. Consider for a moment what stillness actually is inside a neuron. We speak of firing, of spikes, of the electrical chatter of the brain, and it is easy to imagine that a resting neuron is doing nothing, that quiet is simply the absence of activity, an empty room. But quiet is not empty. Quiet is maintained. A resting neuron holds itself at roughly negative 70 millivolts, its inside kept persistently more negative than the world outside, and that voltage is not a default that happens on its own. It is a labor, a continuous, small expense of energy and ionic bookkeeping, and at the center of that labor is a class of channels that most people have never heard named. The 2-pore domain potassium channels, the K2P family, the leak channels that never fully close. Most ion channels you might picture are gates. They are shut, and then a signal arrives, a voltage change, a neurotransmitter binding, and they swing open for a moment and then shut again. GABA-A is like that, a chloride gate that opens when GABA binds. The voltage-gated sodium channel is like that, snapping open to let the spike race down the axon. But the K2P channels are different in their very disposition. They are not gates waiting for a signal. They are pores that leak, always slightly ajar, letting potassium ions drift outward down their gradient, a slow and constant seepage that has no dramatic moment of opening because it never truly closes. This is what physiologists mean by a background current, or a leak current. A steady, unglamorous trickle of positive charge leaving the cell. And it is precisely this trickle that pulls the membrane potential downward and holds it there, negative and patient, waiting. The family has members with names that sound almost like weather stations. Trek 1, the TWIC-related potassium channel. Task 1 and Task 3, the TWIC-related acid-sensitive potassium channels. TRAC. Their acronyms unfold into a small taxonomy of quietness, and each has its own personality, its own sensitivity to stretch, to temperature, to the acidity of the fluid around it, to the lipids in the membrane itself. Trek 1 opens wider when the membrane is stretched, when the cell warms, when polyunsaturated fatty acids brush against it. Task 1 and Task 3 respond to the pH of their surroundings, closing as things turn acidic, opening as they turn alkaline. They are sensors as much as they are conduits, tasting the local conditions of the neuron and adjusting the leak accordingly, and in doing so, they are always, quietly, setting the floor. Now here is the mechanism that matters, the reason these obscure pores belong in a story about switching off consciousness. The volatile anesthetics, the halogenated ethers that flow through the vaporizers of every operating room in the world, isoflurane, sevoflurane, desflurane, do something remarkable to these channels. They open them further. Isoflurane, drifting into the lipid membrane, binds to or bends around the K2P channel and enhances its leak, and Trek 1 in particular responds to this with a marked increase in current. The pore that was already ajar swings a little wider. The trickle of potassium leaving the cell becomes a stream. And with more positive charge flooding outward, the inside of the neuron grows more negative still. Not negative 70 millivolts now, but negative 80, negative 85, drifting further and further from the threshold it would need to reach in order to fire. This is a mechanism entirely distinct from the one we have been tracing through GABA-A. The barbiturates and the propofol and the etomidate we spoke of earlier work at the synapse, at the moment of transmission, prying open chloride gates when a signal arrives, so that the receiving neuron is silenced just as the message lands. That is intervention at the point of communication. But the K2P channels are not about communication at all. They act on the resting state itself, on the baseline stillness that exists before any message is ever sent. They do not close a gate through which signals pass. They lower the whole pool of excitability beneath the level at which any signal could matter. And that is the analogy worth holding on to through the dark. Imagine a swimming pool with a diving board suspended above it. The neuron's firing threshold is the diving board, the height a signal must reach to trigger a spike. Now, one way to prevent a dive is to close the gate to the board, to block the ladder, to stop the swimmer before they climb. That is the GABA-A strategy, the synaptic strategy. Intervene at the moment of approach. But there is another way entirely. You can drain the pool. You can lower the water so far beneath the board that even a swimmer who reaches the very edge and leaps will find nothing there to dive into. only distance, only the impossibility of the surface. The volatile anesthetics, by opening TREC1 and its kin, drain the pool. They lower the resting potential so deep beneath threshold that the neuron, however it is prodded, cannot rise to meet the moment. The gate is irrelevant when the water is gone. And so the hyperpolarized neuron sits there, drained and negative and unreachable. An excitatory signal arrives, glutamate spilling across the synapse, depolarizing currents nudging the membrane upward, and ordinarily this would carry the cell toward its threshold, toward the all-or-nothing avalanche of the action potential. But now, the membrane starts from so far below, and the leak pulls back so insistently that the nudge simply fades. The cell rises a little and sinks again. It cannot reach. Multiply this across billions of neurons, across the thalamus and the cortex and the brainstem, and you have not silenced a conversation. You have lowered the ground beneath every voice in the room until none of them can be heard, because none of them can rise. How do we know this is real and not merely a plausible story told about a molecule? The evidence is unusually direct, and it comes from mice. Researchers bred animals lacking the gene for TREC1, knockout mice, whose neurons cannot build that particular leak channel at all. If TREC1 were merely incidental, a bystander to anesthesia, removing it should change nothing. But it changed a great deal. The TREC1 knockout mice proved measurably resistant to volatile anesthetics. It took more isoflurane, more halothane, more of the inhaled agent to bring them under than it took their normal littermates. The drug still worked. Anesthesia is never one channel, and the other targets remained. But a piece of its power was gone, missing precisely where the channel was missing. This is the cleanest kind of mechanistic evidence pharmacology can offer. Remove the molecule you suspect and watch the effect diminish in proportion. The pool would not drain as far when there was no TREC1 to open. The stillness came harder. And the noble gases join this same quiet chorus, though more faintly. Xenon, that inert and aristocratic atom, and nitrous oxide, whose braided action we traced only moments ago, both touch the K2P family among their other effects. They are not primarily leak channel drugs the way the volatile ethers are. Xenon's headline act is blocking the NMDA receptor, and nitrous oxides is the same. But they too brush against these background channels, nudging the leak a little wider, contributing their small drainage to the falling water. Which tells us something essential about the entire enterprise. There is no single channel of anesthesia. There is no master switch. There is only a convergence. Many drugs, many targets, many small effects summing toward the same shore. Say it plainly, because it is the truest thing we can say about how these drugs work. Anesthesia is polypharmacology. It is not one lock and one key. A single volatile molecule like isoflurane drifting through the brain does not do one thing. It does a dozen things at once, in a dozen places, with no single one of them sufficient, and no single one of them necessary. It enhances GABA-A currents at the inhibitory synapse. It potentiates glycine receptors in the spinal cord. It inhibits certain excitatory receptors, and it opens the K2P leak channels, TREC1, task1, task3, track, draining the resting potential towards silence. Every one of these is a partial effect. Every one of these is a fractional dimming, and it is only their sum, their overlap, their simultaneous convergence across families of proteins that were never designed to work together, that carries a mind all the way down into oblivion. There is something almost humbling in that. We imagine a drug as a precise instrument, a scalpel that finds its single target and does its single thing. But the anesthetics are not scalpels. They are more like a slow change in the weather, a drop in pressure that touches every surface at once, that thickens the air in every room of the house simultaneously, that no single window can keep out because it is not coming through any window. Isoflurane does not enter the neuron through one door. It dissolves into the lipid of the membrane itself and reshapes the behavior of everything embedded there. And among the things it reshapes are these ancient, patient leak channels that were doing their quiet work of stillness long before any surgery was ever imagined. Because that is the strange truth of Trek 1 and its family. They were never built for anesthesia. They evolved to set the resting voltage of neurons across the animal kingdom, to sense stretch and temperature and acid, to hold the baseline that makes signaling possible in the first place. The delicate stillness they maintain is not the stillness of sleep or the stillness of surgery. It is the stillness that underlies all waking thought, the quiet negative floor from which every spike must launch. And the anesthetic does not invent a new mechanism. It borrows an old one. It takes a channel whose entire purpose is to hold neurons at their patient baseline, and it leans on that purpose, pressing the leak wider, drawing the floor lower, using the neuron's own machinery for quietness against the neuron itself. Feel, for a moment, how this differs from everything before it. The GABA-A drugs make the brain say no. They amplify inhibition. They strengthen the signals that mean stop. But the leak channels do not say no. They say nothing at all. They simply remove the possibility of yes. A hyperpolarized neuron is not being told to be silent. It is being placed beyond the reach of speech, drained beneath the level where speech begins. And there is a peculiar gentleness to that. No clamor of inhibition, no active suppression, only a slow settling downward, a quiet withdrawal of the ground, until the cell rests too low to be roused. And so the picture assembles itself, layer upon layer, target upon target. The chloride gates of GABA-A prying open at the synapse. The blocked NMDA receptors of ketamine and xenon and nitrous oxide refusing the excitatory word. The two poor leak channels, Trek 1 and Task 1 and Task 3, draining the resting pool beneath the diving board until no signal, however it climbs, can find water to fall into. No single mechanism carries the whole weight. No single channel switches off the mind. There is only the convergence, the chloride, the potassium, the calcium, the glutamate, the glycine, all of it shifting a fraction at once, all of it summing toward the same descending quiet. Every leak, every gate, every channel that was open, every channel that was closed. The anesthetic touches them not as a single decisive act, but as a slow, distributed persuasion, a lowering of the whole electrical landscape of the brain by 1,000 small hands at once. And the potassium, drifting outward through pores that never fully close, drawing the voltage down and down beneath the threshold of thought, is one of the oldest and quietest of those hands, a draining of the pool, a withdrawing of the ground, a stillness borrowed from the very machinery that once made waking possible. And still there is more to the descent than gates and leaks. And still There is more to the descent than gates and leaks. For all the elegance of channels opening and closing, all the quiet persuasion of chloride and potassium drifting where they will, we are left with a stubborn, practical question, the kind a surgeon must answer with their hands and not their wonder. How much? How much of this vapor, drawn breath by breath into the lungs, is enough to still a body against the knife? Too little, and the patient stirs, and the whole fragile stillness fails. Too much, and the heart begins to falter, the pressure drains from the vessels, the breath forgets to come. Somewhere between those two shores lies a narrow channel, and to sail it night after night, in bodies large and small, young and old, the anaesthetist needs a number, not a feeling, a number. That number is called the minimum alveolar concentration, and among all the quiet arithmetic of this field, it is perhaps the most beautiful, because it takes something as vast and unknowable as the depth of unconsciousness and pins it to a single measurable thing. The concentration of anesthetic gas in the tiny air sacs at the bottom of the lungs, the alveoli, at the moment of steady state. MAC, they call it, the minimum alveolar concentration. And the definition is exact, almost austere in its precision. MAC is the alveolar concentration of an inhaled anesthetic that prevents movement in 50% of patients in response to a standardized surgical stimulus, classically a skin incision. 50%. Not everyone. Half. At 1 MAC, half the bodies on the table would lie still to the knife, and half would move. It is a threshold defined by the population, not the person, a statistical shoreline drawn through a fog of individual variation. And why the alveoli? Why measure the gas there, in the deepest branchings of the lung, rather than in the blood or the brain, where the real work is done? Because at steady state, when the vapor has been flowing long enough for the system to settle, the concentration in the alveolar air is in equilibrium with the concentration in the arterial blood, and the arterial blood is in equilibrium with the brain. The alveolus becomes a window. A breath sampled at the mouth becomes a reading of the brain's own dose, without a single needle passing through the skull. The vapor you exhale tells you the vapor bathing your neurons. Measure the tide at the shore, and you know the depth of the sea. Now hold this MAC number up against the old lipid law we met before, the Meyer-Overton correlation, that century-old observation that the more readily an anesthetic dissolves into oil, into the fatty membranes of the cell, the more potent it is. Watch what happens. Potency and MAC run in opposite directions, like two ends of a seesaw. A potent agent needs only a little of itself in the alveoli to do its work, and so its MAC is low. A weak agent needs a great deal, and its MAC is high. And when you plot MAC against oil solubility across the whole family of these gases, the points fall along a line so clean it is almost unnerving. The product of MAC and the oil-gas partition coefficient stays roughly constant. High lipid solubility, low MAC, high potency. Low lipid solubility, high MAC, low potency. The seesaw never breaks. The membrane still whispers the old law, even now, even through this modern number. So let us name the vapors themselves, the volatile agents, the ones poured as liquid into a vaporizer and swept into the lungs on a river of oxygen. There are 3 you will meet most often in a modern operating room, and each has a personality written into its molecule. Sevoflurane is the gentle one. Its MAC sits around 2%, meaning roughly 2% of the inspired gas at steady state, will still half the patients on the table. It is not pungent. It does not sting the airway or provoke the reflexive coughing and breath-holding that harsher agents can. And so it can be given by mask, breath after sweet breath, to a frightened child who has never seen an intravenous line, drawing them down into sleep without a single needle. A slow, kind sinking, like being lowered into warm water by hands you never see. Fast to induce, mild to breathe, forgiving in its rise. This is why it has become the vapor of gentle beginnings. Isoflurane is the potent one and the pungent one. Its MAC is lower, closer to 1.25%, which by the seesaw law means it is more powerful, more lipid-soluble, more at home in the fatty membranes. But it is sharp on the airway. Breathe it in raw, and it stings. It makes the throat clench and the cough rise, and so it is rarely used to send a patient under from waking. Instead, it is a workhorse of maintenance, introduced once the patient is already asleep, once the airway is secured, holding the depth steady through the long middle hours of surgery. Powerful, economical, and a little unkind to the awake throat. A vapor for the depths, not the doorway. And desflurane is the quick one, the volatile sprinter, defined not by its potency, but by its speed. To understand it, we need one more number, the blood-gas partition coefficient. This is the measure of how greedily the blood dissolves a given gas relative to the alveolar air. And here is the counterintuitive heart of inhaled anesthetic pharmacokinetics, the fact that turns ordinary intuition on its head. The less soluble a gas is in blood, the faster it works. Because it is the partial pressure, the pressure the gas exerts, its tendency to move, that drives it into the brain, not the sheer quantity dissolved. A gas that the blood drinks up eagerly, with a high blood-gas coefficient, has its partial pressure blunted. The blood acts as a vast reservoir that must be filled before the alveolar pressure can climb and the brain can feel it. But a gas that the blood barely holds, with a low blood-gas coefficient, cannot be hidden away. Its partial pressure rises swiftly in the alveoli, swiftly in the arterial blood, swiftly in the brain. The reservoir is small, and so it fills at once. Desflurane has the lowest blood-gas partition coefficient of the common volatiles, around 0.42, which means the blood scarcely holds it, which means it arrives at the brain almost as fast as it is breathed in, and leaves almost as fast as it is breathed out. On and off like a switch you can feel under your thumb. Turn the dial up, and the patient descends within minutes. Turn it down, and they surface just as quickly, the vapor pouring back out through the same alveoli that let it in, its partial pressure collapsing as fast as it rose. This is the great gift of low solubility, precise control, rapid emergence, a depth you can steer moment to moment. But it comes at a strange cost. Desflurane boils at almost room temperature, around 23 degrees Celsius, so volatile that an ordinary vaporizer could not deliver it in a steady, predictable stream. And so it requires a special vaporizer, one that is electrically heated and pressurized, holding the liquid at a controlled temperature so that its delivery does not swing wildly with the warmth of the room. The fastest of the vapors needs a heated machine to hold its restlessness in check. Notice what unites all three, what runs beneath sevoflurane's kindness and isoflurane's power and desflurane's speed. They enter through the lungs, not the gut. There is no first-pass metabolism, no long journey through the liver before they reach the blood. They cross the delicate alveolar membrane directly into the pulmonary circulation, one molecule at a time, driven by nothing but the difference in partial pressure between air and blood. And here is the quietest wonder of all. They are barely changed by the body at all. The liver, that great chemical furnace that dismantles nearly every other drug we take, scarcely touches them. Sevoflurane is metabolized only a few %, desflurane less than a fraction of 1%. The overwhelming majority of these vapors do not leave transformed. They leave whole. They come in as they are, and they go out as they are, exhaled molecule by molecule back into the room, the same shape they arrived in, having done their work and touched their targets and changed nothing of themselves. Elimination by exhalation. The body borrows them and returns them intact, a tide that comes in and goes out and leaves the sand exactly as it found it. Every breath in, uptake across the alveoli. Every breath out, elimination through the same doors. Every molecule crossing on partial pressure alone. Every gas obeying the same seesaw of solubility and speed. No first-pass loss, no livers dismantling, no metabolite to clear. Only the lungs, breathing the vapor in and breathing it out, in and out. The whole pharmacology of the inhaled anesthetic reduced to the ancient rhythm of respiration. In, and the depth climbs. Out, and the depth falls. The oldest motion of the living body turned into a dial, and Mac gives us one more elegant power, the power to add. Because these agents, and the others we layer alongside them, are largely additive in their effect. If a patient breathes half a Mac of one agent and half a Mac of another, the anaesthetist reckons the effect as roughly one full Mac, the fractions summing toward the same threshold of stillness. This is Mac additivity, and it is what makes modern anesthesia not a single drug, but a chord. Several agents sounded together, each contributing a portion of the whole. And it is what lets us do something gentler still, to lower the vapor by leaning on other molecules entirely. Give an opioid, fentanyl, remifentanil, morphine, binding to the mu-opioid receptors that dampen the transmission of pain and stress through the spinal cord and the brainstem, and the Mac of the volatile agent falls. The body needs less vapor to lie still, because the incoming storm of the surgical stimulus has already been quieted upstream at the mu receptor before it ever reaches the threshold that Mac measures. Add an alpha-2 agonist, dexmedetomidine, clonidine, molecules that press upon the alpha-2 adrenergic receptors of the brainstem's locus ceruleus, that small blue nucleus which pours out the arousing neurotransmitter norepinephrine, and quiet its firing, and Mac falls again. Less norepinephrine, less arousal, less vapor needed to hold the stillness. Each drug shaves the requirement of the others. Each receptor engaged lets the anaesthetist turn the vaporizer down a notch, and with it, the cost to the heart, the drop in the blood pressure, the depth of the eventual climb back out. And so, the number that began as a measure of a single gas becomes a kind of ledger, a running account of every molecule contributing to the stillness. So much from the vapor at the GABA-A receptor, so much subtracted by the opioid at the mu receptor, so much subtracted by the alpha-2 agonist at the locus ceruleus. A balance struck, breath by breath, between the vapor rising in the alveoli and the pain silenced in the cord and the arousal dimmed in the brainstem, all summing toward that single statistical shoreline where half of all bodies fall still. The number does not know your name. It knows only the population, the tide, the 50%. And yet, the anaesthetist, watching the dial and the exhaled breath and the slow rhythm of the vaporizers rise and fall, uses it to steer you, this one body, this one night, down the narrow channel between the too little and the too much, held there not by a single hand, but by a cord of many, each pressing its own receptor, each shaving its own fraction from the whole. And still, even knowing the number, even watching the vapor rise and fall in the alveoli like breath on a cold window, we have not yet asked where in the brain all this stillness gathers, which regions fall silent first, and which cling longest to the light. So, let us go inward now, past the blood and the alveolus, past the membrane and the channel, into the architecture of the brain itself, to ask the question that the receptor alone can never answer. Because a drug does not switch off a mind by binding a single molecule in a single cell. It binds billions of them, scattered across a landscape of unimaginable complexity. And somewhere in the pattern of all that binding, consciousness quietly withdraws. The receptor is the key, but we have not yet found the lock. And the lock, it turns out, is not a molecule at all. It is a conversation, a vast, ceaseless, looping conversation between two regions of the brain. And when anesthesia falls, it is that conversation, and not any single cell, that goes silent. Imagine the brain as a city at night, seen from far above. The cortex is the sprawl of it, the outer mantle, wrinkled and folded, where perception is assembled and thought takes shape, where the redness of red and the ache of a memory and the sound of your own name are woven into the seamless felt of experience. And deep beneath that mantle, near the very center, sits a small paired structure the size of 2 walnuts, the thalamus. It is the switchboard of the sleeping city, the central relay through which nearly every signal must pass. Sight, sound, touch, taste, almost all of it, everything except smell, is routed first through the thalamus before it is delivered upward to the cortex. Nothing reaches the mantle unannounced. The thalamus is the gate through which the world walks in. But it is not merely a gate. It is a partner in an endless dialogue. For every fiber that climbs from the thalamus up into the cortex, there are many more that descend the other way. Cortex speaking back down to thalamus, thalamus answering up to cortex, in loops that fire and re-fire in rhythmic waves, 10, 20, 40 times a second. This is the thalamocortical system, and it does not rest when you rest. It is the humming machinery of awareness itself, a recurrent circuit in which information is not simply passed along, but integrated, bound together, held in a single unified frame, so that the light and the sound and the touch of this moment become one moment, yours, whole. Consciousness, on the best current account, is not a place in the brain. It is this integration. It is the sustained, high-bandwidth conversation of many regions speaking to many others, and to the thalamus at their hub, all at once. And here is where the many keys find their one lock. For every molecular story we have told across these chapters, every different drug, every different receptor, converges at the level of the network upon this same conversation. The GABA-A receptor, thrown open by propofol and the volatile agents, floods its neurons with chloride and hushes them. But the neurons it hushes most consequentially are the ones that carry the thalamocortical dialogue. The two pore domain potassium channels, the K2P family, TREC 1, Task 1, Task 3, pried open by the inhaled anesthetics, let potassium leak steadily outward, dragging the resting membrane downward, away from the threshold of firing, and the cells they silence are woven through the very same loops. Ketamine's blockade of the NMDA receptor severs a different thread, choking off the fast excitatory glutamate signaling that lets cortex and thalamus answer one another. And dexmedetomidine, pressing on the alpha-2 adrenergic receptor, quiets the arousal-promoting brainstem nuclei, the locus ceruleus above all, whose noradrenaline normally keeps the thalamus awake and relaying. 4 different keys, 4 different molecular doors, and behind every one of them, the same room goes dark. This is the spine of the whole strange story, and I want you to hold it now as we descend into the technical heart of it. The molecular diversity is real, and it is vast, and it does not matter as much as you would think. GABA-A on chloride, K2P on potassium, NMDA on glutamate, alpha-2 on noradrenaline. These are radically different mechanisms, acting on different ions at different synapses in different cells. Yet they all arrive, by their separate roads, at a single common destination. They disrupt the thalamocortical loop. They fragment the conversation. Diverse molecular keys, one common network lock. Say it to yourself as the city dims, because everything that follows is only this truth, drawn out in finer and finer detail. Consider, then, what the brain actually does as the drug rises, not in metaphor now, but in measured signal, in the pictures the scanners make and the traces the electrodes draw. When positron emission tomography watches a brain slide from wakefulness into general anesthesia, it sees the whole organ dim its metabolism, its consumption of glucose and oxygen falling as the neurons quiet. But the dimming is not even. It is not a lamp turned smoothly down. Certain regions fall faster and further than the rest, and again, across propofol and the volatile agents and beyond, one structure shows among the deepest and most consistent suppression of blood flow and metabolism of all. The thalamus, the switchboard. As consciousness withdraws, it is the central relay, more than almost anywhere else, that goes cold. Its metabolism dropping, its blood flow ebbing, its activity sinking toward a flaw. This is the observation at the heart of what is sometimes called the thalamic consciousness switch. The idea that the thalamus is not merely one silenced region among many, but a hub whose quieting throws the whole system out of the state we call awake. Now, the honest scientist adds a caution here, and we will keep it light. It is not certain that the thalamus is the master switch, the single throw that ends the mind. The picture is almost certainly more distributed than that, more a matter of the whole network than of any one node. The thalamus may be less the switch itself than the place where the switch's failure shows most plainly, its metabolism collapsing because the cortical conversation that ordinarily drives it has fallen quiet. Cortex and thalamus are so tightly bound that when one goes silent, the other cannot help but follow, and untangling which leads and which follows is the work of laboratories still. But whatever the direction of the arrow, the observation holds, steady across drug after drug. The thalamocortical system, taken as a whole, uncouples. The loop breaks. The partners fall out of conversation. And it is in that breaking, more than in any single dimmed region, that the light goes out. Watch it then, in the raw voice of the brain, in the electroencephalogram, the EEG, the trembling line drawn from electrodes on the scalp that reads the summed electrical chorus of millions of cortical neurons firing together. In waking, the line is fast and low and irregular, a fine, restless hum, the sign of a cortex full of many small conversations, many regions, each doing their own quick work, richly differentiated and richly connected all at once. This is the electrical signature of a mind at work, complex, unpredictable, alive with information. And then the drug rises and the line begins to change. It slows, it swells. The fast, fine hum gives way to great, slow, rolling waves, high and synchronous, the delta rhythm of deep unconsciousness, in which vast populations of neurons that once whispered their separate messages now fall into lockstep and shout the same dull syllable together, over and over. A cortex, all saying one thing at once, is a cortex saying nothing. Synchrony, past a certain point, is the death of information. When every neuron does the same thing, no neuron carries news. And if the anesthetic deepens further still, the EEG passes into a pattern stranger and more stark than any slow wave, a pattern called burst suppression. Here, the trembling line does something almost violent in its simplicity. It goes flat, silent, a stretch of near-perfect electrical stillness, seconds long, in which the cortex falls utterly quiet, no message anywhere across the mantle. And then, without warning, a burst, a brief chaotic flurry of high-voltage activity, a spasm of firing that erupts and rolls across the cortex before it collapses again into silence. Burst, then suppression. Flurry, then flatness. On, then off, in a slow alternation that can stretch across seconds, the whole cortex flickering between spasm and void like a failing filament. This is the electrical fingerprint of a brain pressed near the very floor of function, and it is produced, remarkably, by all the major anesthetics, propofol, the volatiles, the barbiturates, despite the diversity of their molecular doors. Different keys, the same failing light. Burst suppression is what the collapse of the thalamocortical conversation looks like when it is written out in voltage. A cortex no longer sustaining the continuous, differentiated, integrated murmur of awareness, but stuttering instead between empty silence and meaningless discharge. So imagine the dimming now from the inside, not from above the city, but from within it. If only such a thing could be felt, though of course the deepest truth of anesthesia is that it cannot be felt at all, that there is no one home to feel it. But imagine it anyway, in the fading moments at the border, as the loop begins to break. First, the periphery of experience grows uncertain. The far rooms of the sprawling cortex, the places where a sound is turned into meaning, where a face becomes recognition, where the thread of a thought reaches back to what came before. These grow harder to reach, because the messages that ordinarily bind them to the rest are no longer arriving. The signals still fire, here and there, in isolated pockets. A neuron in the visual cortex still answers to light. A neuron in the auditory cortex still answers to sound. But the answers no longer travel. They no longer combine. The long-range fibers that used to carry a signal from one side of the mantle to the other, that used to let the seeing and the hearing and the remembering fuse into one seamless present, fall quiet. And so the moment ceases to be one moment. It shatters into fragments that never meet. The redness has no one to be read for. This is the loss of integration, measured now not in poetry, but in the mathematics of information, in studies where a small magnetic pulse is delivered to the waking cortex, and the resulting ripple is watched as it spreads. In the waking brain, that ripple travels far and wide and complex, echoing from region to region in an intricate, unrepeatable pattern. Because the cortex is one connected whole, richly capable of carrying a disturbance from any point to any other. That spreading complexity can even be scored, a perturbational complexity index, a number that runs high in the conscious brain. But deliver the same pulse to the anesthetized cortex, and the ripple dies close to where it began. It spreads a little, stereotyped and simple, and then it fades, because the long-range connections that would have carried it onward have gone silent. The cortex is still there, the neurons are still alive, still capable of firing, but they have been cut off from one another. The city is intact and dark and full of sleeping citizens who can no longer send word across the streets between them. And this, in the end, is what all the molecular stories were building toward. The reason the receptor alone could never answer the question. Chloride flooding inward through GABA-A, potassium leaking outward through TREC and TASC, glutamate's message blocked at the NMDA gate, noradrenaline withheld by the alpha-2 brake on the locus ceruleus. Each of these, on its own, is a small local hush, a single cell tilted towards silence. But the drug does not tilt one cell. It tilts billions, and it tilts them in a pattern that falls most heavily upon the connections between regions, upon the thalamus at the hub and the long fibers that lace the cortex together, until the recurrent loop that is the physical body of your awareness can no longer sustain itself. The neurons survive. The metabolism, dimmed, goes on. But the conversation stops. And when the conversation stops, so do you. Diverse molecular keys, one common lock. And the lock, we can now say plainly, is not a receptor, and not a cell, and not even a single region. The lock is the network. It is the integrated, recurrent, thalamocortical conversation itself. And every anesthetic ever discovered, by whatever molecular road it travels, is in the end only a way of interrupting that conversation, of fragmenting the whole into pieces that cannot speak to one another, of collapsing the many voices of the waking brain into slow, synchronous waves, and then into the flickering emptiness of burst suppression, and then, at the deepest reach, into a silence that carries no news at all. The lights, when they go out, do not go out in a single cell. The lights, when they go out, do not go out in a single cell, but across the whole network at once. And here is the danger that has haunted this drug since the very first ether frolic. Because the same molecular touch that quiets the cortex does not stop politely at the border of consciousness. It keeps going. It reaches down into the brainstem, into the ancient machinery that never sleeps, the medullary respiratory centers that fire in their patient rhythm whether you attend to them or not, the vasomotor tone that holds your blood pressure aloft, the reflex arcs that guard your airway. And those structures speak the same molecular language as the cortex above them. They too are studded with GABA-A receptors. They too have voltage-gated channels that can be silenced. The anesthetic cannot read the label on the door. It only knows the receptor, and the receptor is everywhere. This is why anesthesia has always lived on a razor's edge, and pharmacology has a name for the width of that edge: the therapeutic index. It is a ratio, deceptively simple: the dose that kills divided by the dose that heals, or, in the more careful language of the lab, the median lethal dose over the median effective dose. A wide index is a wide beach. You may wander far from the effective dose before the water reaches you. A narrow index is a cliff path in fog, where the step that works and the step that ends you are separated by almost nothing at all. And the great classical anesthetics walk the cliff path. Consider the barbiturates, thiopental first among them, the drug that for decades opened the door to sleep. Thiopental binds the GABA-A receptor at its barbiturate site and does something quietly ferocious. At higher concentrations, it does not merely help the brain's own GABA open the chloride channel more often. It flings the channel open itself, directly, without waiting for GABA at all. This is the difference between coaxing and commanding. And a drug that commands has no ceiling. The more you give, the more channels gape wide, the more chloride floods in, the deeper the silence spreads. Down through cortex, down through the reticular formation, down at last into the medulla, where the command to breathe simply stops being issued. There is no natural limit. The dose that stills the cortex and the dose that stills the breath are neighbors on the same steep slope, and thiopental's therapeutic index is one of the narrowest in medicine. Propofol, the milk-white emulsion that has replaced it for induction, is gentler in reputation, but not in essence. It too works chiefly at GABA-A, potentiating, and at higher doses directly opening the chloride channel, and it too depresses the medullary drive. Its margin is wider than thiopental's, but not by a comfortable stretch. Give it slowly, and you have a graceful descent into sleep. Give it a little too fast, a little too much, and the same fall continues past the floor. The respiratory rate slides, the tidal volume shrinks, the airway muscles slacken, the tongue falls back, and the reflexes that would normally guard against all of this, the cough, the gag, the swallow, are gone, abolished by the very drug that abolished consciousness. Propofol also loosens the vasomotor tone, dilating the vessels and softening the heart's contraction, so that blood pressure drifts downward even as breathing fails. This is the shape of an anesthetic overdose, and it is worth naming plainly. Respiratory depression, loss of airway reflexes, cardiovascular collapse. 3 verdicts, arriving in sequence, each one closer to the last silence. This is why anesthesiologists exist. Not to choose the drug, a pharmacist could recite the doses. They exist to stand on the cliff path with you, to hold the edge, to breathe for you when you cannot, to push the pressure back up with vasopressors when it sags, to secure the airway the reflexes no longer guard. The entire specialty is, in a sense, a profession built around a single terrible fact: that the drug which switches off consciousness is only a dose away from switching off life, and that the gap between the two is so narrow that a human being must sit beside it, watching, for every minute of the sleep. Some drugs, though, widen the beach. And here the molecular story turns, because not every road to unconsciousness runs through the brainstem's breathing centers with the same brute force. Ketamine is the great outlier. It does not lean on GABA at all. It is an antagonist at the NMDA glutamate receptor, wedging itself into the open channel pore and blocking the excitatory current that binds the cortex into its integrated whole. It severs the thalamo-cortical conversation from a different angle entirely, a dissociative angle, uncoupling the sensory world from the felt self. And crucially, it does not command the medulla into silence. Breathing continues. Airway reflexes are largely preserved. The heart, far from sagging, is often driven faster and stronger, because ketamine blocks the reuptake of catecholamines like noradrenaline, so the sympathetic tone rises rather than falls. Its therapeutic index is far kinder. The beach is wide. This is why ketamine belongs to the battlefield and the disaster zone and the child who cannot be monitored closely, because it forgives. Dexmedetomidine widens the margin along yet another road. It is an agonist at the alpha-2 adrenergic receptor, concentrated densely in the locus ceruleus, that small blue-black cluster in the brainstem that is the brain's chief source of noradrenaline and the master switch of arousal. By quieting the locus ceruleus, dexmedetomidine produces a sedation that runs strangely close to natural sleep, a descent through pathways the brain itself uses each night, and it does so without the heavy hand on the respiratory drive that GABA-ergic drugs bring. Breathing is largely spared. The sleep it makes is a sleep from which a voice can rouse you. It is not a cliff at all, but a gentle slope, precisely because it does not silence the medulla, only lowers the volume of the arousal system that sits above it. So the margin is not fixed. It is a property of the molecular road, and some roads run along the edge of the cliff, while others keep to the broad and level shore. But every road, in the end, must be travelled back. And this is where the story of anesthesia opens into its deepest, quietest mystery. The mystery not of going down, but of coming back. We assumed for the better part of 2 centuries that emergence was simply induction played in reverse. That as the drug washed out of the blood, redistributed into fat and muscle, was metabolized by the hepatic cytochrome enzymes and cleared by the kidney, its concentration at the receptor would fall, and the brain would climb the same staircase it had descended, rung by rung, in the opposite direction. The chloride channels would close, the conversation would resume, the lights would come back on the way they went off. It seemed obvious. It seemed almost beneath asking. It is not true. The brain does not wake the way it fell asleep, and the discovery of this asymmetry has a name that sounds almost geological: neural inertia. There is a hysteresis in it, a lag, a memory in the system, so that the concentration of drug required to wake a brain is measurably lower than the concentration that put it under. The brain resists the transition in both directions. Having settled into unconsciousness, it does not simply drift back up when the drug clears. It must be actively pushed, and the state it holds has a stickiness, a reluctance that pure pharmacokinetics cannot explain. The drug is leaving the receptor. The lights, for a time, stay off anyway. And so, emergence, we now understand, is not a passive fading, but an active reboot, a process the brain must run, a sequence it must execute, and the machinery that runs it is precisely the machinery of arousal that the anesthetic silenced. The locus coeruleus stirs, and noradrenaline begins once more to flood the cortex through the alpha and beta adrenergic receptors, raising the excitability of neurons that had gone quiet. The cholinergic centers of the basal forebrain and the brainstem reawaken, and acetylcholine returns to the thalamus and cortex, where it desynchronizes the slow anesthetic waves and restores the fast, low-voltage activity of the waking mind. And threaded through all of it, The orexin system, those few thousand neurons in the lateral hypothalamus that stabilize wakefulness itself, the same neurons whose loss produces narcolepsy, must fire again to hold the emerging brain in the waking state and keep it from sliding back down. Block the orexin receptors in an animal, and emergence from anesthesia slows. The return, it turns out, is not the absence of drug. It is the presence of an active, ancient waking program switched back on. This is the humbling reversal. We know a great deal about how to put the brain down. The GABA-A receptor, the NMDA channel, the alpha-2 receptor, the potassium leak channels, the collapse of the thalamocortical conversation, and we understand comparatively little about how it climbs back out. The coming back is its own unsolved process, a reassembly of the integrated whole from its fragments, orchestrated by noradrenaline and acetylcholine and orexin, in a sequence we are only beginning to trace. Every night, when you fall asleep and wake again, you run a version of this same reboot without a thought. Under anesthesia, we borrow the machinery, silence it more deeply than sleep ever does, and then trust that it will restart. Almost always it does. The staggering fact is not that people wake up, it is that we still cannot fully say how. And beneath all of it, unspoken in the calm of the operating room, lies the truth this chapter has been circling from its first sentence. The line between anesthesia and death is a dose. It is not a line of kind, but a line of degree. The same receptors, the same channels, the same brainstem centers, touched a little more firmly, tip from reversible silence into the silence that does not reverse. The drug that stills the cortex and the process that stops the heart are separated not by a wall, but by a number, by milligrams, by the width of a therapeutic index, by the vigilance of the person watching the monitor. Deep anesthesia and the edge of death are neighbors on one continuous slope, and the whole delicate art is to descend far enough and no further, to hold the brain in the narrow country between the waking storm and the final quiet, and then to guide it back up the active, mysterious staircase of arousal into the light. So when you next lie down for sleep, the ordinary sleep, the free sleep, the one that costs no dose and needs no watcher, consider what your own brainstem does without being asked. The locus ceruleus dims and brightens on its own schedule. The orexin neurons hold you waking through the day and release you gently at night. The medulla breathes for you through every hour of the dark, asking nothing. You climb down into sleep and back up into morning again and again, running the reboot flawlessly, never once needing a hand on the edge to keep the dose from becoming a death. It is the most extraordinary thing your body does, and it does it in silence, and it does it for free. The lights go out, and the lights come back on, and between them lies a country we can enter and leave and still barely understand. And so we arrive at the strangest place of all, which is not a place in the brain, but a gap in our knowing. We can name the drugs, we can name their targets, we can watch, molecule by molecule, the exact machinery of oblivion. And still, at the center of it, there is a question we cannot answer, and it is perhaps the deepest question in all of science. Consider what we have learned. Propofol, that milky-white emulsion, binds to a site on the GABA-A receptor and holds its chloride channel open, letting negative charge flood into neuron after neuron until they cannot fire, until the cortex falls quiet. Sevoflurane and isoflurane, the volatile ethers, slip into the lipid membranes and settle onto GABA-A and onto the two pore potassium channels, the TREC and TASC leak channels, coaxing potassium outward and dragging the neuron's voltage down away from threshold. Ketamine blocks the NMDA glutamate receptor from within its own pore, silencing the excitatory chatter that binds one moment to the next. Dexmedetomidine leans on the alpha-2 adrenergic receptor in the locus ceruleus and pulls the brain down through the same doorway sleep itself uses. Every one of these is understood. Every binding site, every ion, every current, every downstream cascade. We know, with real precision, what these molecules do. What we do not know is why any of it should feel like anything at all, or, in this case, why its removal should feel like nothing. This is the hard problem of consciousness, named by the philosopher David Chalmers, and it is worth saying slowly, because everything in these 10 chapters has been circling it. The easy problems of the mind, easy only by comparison, are the ones we have been solving all along. How does the brain integrate sensory information? How does it control attention, lay down memory, direct the body, report on its own states? Those are questions about function, about mechanism, about what the machine does, and those we can, in principle, answer, one receptor and one circuit at a time. Propofol suppresses the function. We can trace how. That is an easy problem, mechanically solved. The hard problem is different in kind. It is the question of why all this processing is accompanied by experience at all. Why is there something it is like to be you? Why does the flood of chloride through a GABA-A channel not simply adjust a system in the dark, silently, the way a thermostat adjusts a furnace with no one home? Why is there instead a felt world that blinks out when the channels open and blinks back when they close? Nothing in the chemistry of the chloride ion tells us this. Nothing in the shape of the propofol molecule contains the redness of red, or the ache of grief, or the plain fact of being present. And yet we can reach into that felt world with a syringe and remove it entirely, reliably, on schedule, and set it back exactly where it was. We are surgeons of a thing we cannot define. Sit with the vertigo of that for a moment, here in the dark. We have built an entire medical specialty, anesthesiology, with its monitors and its careful titrations and its decades of accumulated safety, on the confident manipulation of a phenomenon that no one, anywhere, can explain. We delete consciousness 100,000 times a day across the world, and we do it well, and we cannot say what it is we are deleting. The knife has become expert, while the mystery has stayed whole. There is one theory, more than any other, that tries to build a bridge across this gap, and it is worth resting in tonight because it maps so cleanly onto everything the drugs have taught us. It is called integrated information theory, developed by the neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, and it begins not with the brain, but with experience itself, and asks what experience must be made of. Every conscious moment, Tononi observed, has two properties at once. It is enormously informative. This particular scene, out of all the countless scenes you might be experiencing instead, this exact configuration of sight and sound and feeling rules out an astronomical number of alternatives. And it is unified. You do not experience the color and the shape and the sound as separate deliveries. You experience one seamless whole, all at once, impossible to pull apart. Information and integration. The theory proposes that consciousness simply is integrated information, a quantity Tononi labels with the Greek letter phi. where a system is highly interconnected, where each part shapes and is shaped by the whole, so that the whole holds more information than the sum of its isolated pieces, phi is high. And there, the theory says, is experience. Where the parts are disconnected, where the system fragments into islands that no longer inform one another, phi collapses toward zero, and the light of experience dims with it. And now listen to what that predicts about the syringe. Integrated information theory does not say anesthesia works by shutting neurons off. It says anesthesia works by disconnecting them, by cutting the threads of mutual influence that let the brain function as one integrated whole. And that is precisely, astonishingly, what the measurements show. Recall the thalamocortical system, the great relay we walked through earlier, the thalamus at the center, passing signals up to the cortex and the cortex answering back. A ceaseless conversation looping through the night and the day. When propofol or sevoflurane takes hold, the neurons in the cortex are still there. Many are still firing. But the conversation breaks. The cortex can no longer integrate signals across its distant regions. The front stops talking meaningfully to the back. The thalamocortical loop, that engine of the unified scene, falls out of dialogue. Researchers have measured this directly, sending a magnetic pulse into the cortex and watching how far and how richly the response propagates. In the waking brain, the pulse sets off a complex, spreading, differentiated cascade, region informing region, the signature of high integration. Under anesthesia, the same pulse produces a simple, local, stereotyped blip that dies where it began. The information no longer integrates. Phi has fallen, and the person is gone. Go deeper still, into burst suppression, that far country of the deepest anesthetic planes, where the EEG shows brief flares of activity separated by long, flat silences, seconds at a time, of a cortex saying almost nothing. Here, the integration is not merely reduced, it is nearly abolished. The brain is not dead. The bursts prove it can still fire, but it can no longer weave those firings into anything unified, anything that holds together as a world. The threads are cut so thoroughly that there is almost nothing left to be integrated, and by the theory's lights, there is almost nothing left to be experienced. The machinery hums on. The room is empty. And so we can, at last, distill the spine of everything we have said tonight into its final and quietest form. These small molecules, the propofol, the ether, the ketamine, the dexmedetomidine, do not so much turn off a light as dissolve the room the light was in. Consciousness was never a bulb to be switched. It was a coherence, a mutual holding, billions of neurons informing one another so densely and so seamlessly that a single, unified world arose from the crosstalk. The drugs reach in and loosen the binding. They do not extinguish the neurons, they untie them from one another. And when the integration falls apart, the world it was carrying falls apart with it. Not smashed, not burned, only quietly dissolved, the way a chord ceases to be a chord the moment you lift all but one finger from the strings. Now let us be honest, gently and clearly, about where the settled ends and the unsettled begins, because that honesty is part of the piece. What is settled is the chemistry. The drugs are real. Their targets are real. The GABA-A receptor, the NMDA receptor, the alpha-2 adrenoceptor, the TREC and TASC potassium channels, all confirmed all measured, all reproducible 10,000 times over. The disconnection is real. The fall of integration under anesthesia has been shown in laboratory after laboratory. That much is as solid as anything in medicine. When you lie down beneath the syringe, you are not gambling on a mystery. You are trusting a mechanism understood in exquisite molecular detail. What remains unsettled is the very last step, the step across the gap. Integrated information theory is a theory, not a verdict. It is elegant, it fits the anesthesia data with uncanny grace, and it is also contested, unproven, unfinished. A beautiful hypothesis reaching toward the hard problem, not a proof that has closed it. Whether phi truly is experience or merely tracks it the way a shadow tracks a body without being the body, no one yet knows. We can say with certainty that when the drugs cut the brain's integration, consciousness departs. We cannot yet say why integration and consciousness should be the same thing at all, or whether they are. The correlation is measured. The identity is only proposed. And between the two lies the hard problem still, whole and quiet and waiting. There is something almost tender in that unfinishedness. We have mapped the machinery of oblivion down to the ion, and we still do not know what oblivion erases. We can hold your mind in our hands, dissolve it, and give it back, and we cannot tell you what it was we held. Every night, your own brain does a gentler version of the same act, loosening the thalamocortical dialogue as you fall asleep, drawing the integration down through the stages, letting phi ebb and rise across the night. And you have never once needed to understand it to do it perfectly. So let the question stay open. It does not need you to solve it. The molecules will keep finding their receptors whether or not we ever cross the gap. The chloride will keep flowing through its channels. The conversation between thalamus and cortex will keep breaking and mending on its ancient schedule in the dark. And you, tonight, are simply going to let your own integration soften of its own accord. No syringe, no monitor, no hand on the edge. The room dimming gently as the threads between your neurons loosen and the unified world you carry all day quietly comes apart into sleep. We know what the drugs do. We do not know what we are. And somewhere between those two truths lies the whole strange country of the mind, entered every night, left every morning, and still, after all our precision, barely understood. The lights go out, the lights come back on, and the room they lit remains the deepest question we have. Sleep well. For nearly 2 centuries now, we have been doing this impossible thing. Since that October morning in 1846, when ether first quieted a man beneath the surgeon's knife, we have switched off the human mind, safely, deliberately, millions of times a day, without ever fully knowing what it is we switch off. Think of the scale of it. Every hour, in rooms all over the world, propofol slides into a vein and finds the GABA-A receptor, easing open its chloride channel, letting negative charge pool inside the neuron until it will not fire. Sevoflurane drifts across the alveoli, crosses into the blood, settles into lipid membranes and into the same receptors, and the mind it belongs to simply stops being present. Every future surgery will begin this way. Every person who will ever go under, the not yet born, the not yet injured, will enter this same unexplained dark and, if all goes well, return from it, carrying no memory of the absence. We can measure it exquisitely, We can name the receptor, the half-life, the clearance, the concentration at which awareness dissolves. And still, at the center, the mystery holds. We know the switch, we do not know the light. So let the science come to rest here, gently, on one last true thing. The reason you are awake to hear this, awake for now, is that same chemistry, running the other way. In your cortex tonight, glutamate is still speaking through its NMDA and AMPA channels, still exciting, still saying, stay. And GABA answers it, softly, holding the balance. Excitation and inhibition, tipping and settling, tipping and settling. The delicate seesaw that keeps the room of you lit. The anesthetic simply tips it too far and holds it there. No one has done that tonight. Tonight, the balance shifts on its own, slowly, kindly, the way it was made to. Glutamate quieting, inhibition rising, the threads loosening at their own unhurried pace. Consciousness is a light we have learned to put out and to bring back, again and again, without ever once understanding how it burns. Let it burn low now. Let the balance tip toward the dark. The lights go out. They will come back on. Sleep well.